The galaxy had forgotten what silence sounded like. For 12,000 years, the hum of civilization had never ceased. The endless whir of engines, the rumble of freight ships, the murmur of voices in corridors that spanned continents. From the core worlds to the distant rim, humanity had conquered the stars and declared the conquest eternal. They built monuments to order, to progress, to their own reflection. And at the center of all things was Trantor, a planet wrapped in metal, a world where the sky had been sealed away for centuries beneath layers of steel and glass, where 1 billion souls lived under artificial suns and never once saw the true stars. It was said that if Trantor sneezed, the galaxy caught a fever. Every message, every decree, every order of civilization passed through its endless halls. From orbit, it shimmered like a jewel. Up close, it smelled of oil, sweat, and power. They called it the First Galactic Empire, the final stage of human perfection, the triumph of reason over chaos. But every empire believes that. Every empire thinks itself the end of history. Until history reminds it otherwise, we like to believe progress is linear, that the universe rewards intelligence, discipline, ambition. But the truth is darker. Civilization is not a ladder, it's a cycle of rise and decay, creation and collapse, light and darkness. And the larger the empire, the longer its fall. Because decay begins not at the borders, where enemies lurk, but at the center, where comfort lives. Imagine it, 1 million worlds sending tribute to a single capital that produces nothing. Entire economies existing only to feed bureaucracy scholars who no longer innovate, generals who no longer fight, politicians who no longer believe. When the dream becomes habit, the habit becomes a prison. That was the paradox of Trantor, a world so advanced it could no longer evolve. But somewhere, buried in its labyrinth of data, there was a whisper, a quiet rebellion of thought. A man who looked not to the stars, but to the centuries ahead. A mathematician named Hari Seldon. He claimed to see the future, not through prophecy, but through numbers, and what he saw was the end. Before we descend into that vision, let's step back and ask the question that has haunted every civilization since the dawn of time. Why do empires always plant the seeds of their own collapse? It's not greed, not war, not even corruption. Those are symptoms. The true cause is more subtle and far more tragic. It's the belief that power is permanent. The moment a civilization believes it has conquered change, it has already signed its death warrant. Trantor was built on that illusion, every sector governed by ministries that no longer knew their purpose. Every planet obedient not from loyalty, but inertia. The machinery of empire grinding on because no one could imagine stopping it. And yet, somewhere beneath those steel horizons, Hari Seldon was running his calculations, thousands of equations, millions of variables, the statistical dance of destiny itself, and the pattern was clear. The empire was dying, slowly, inevitably. The collapse would come not in a single cataclysmic event, but in 1,000 small fractures. Trade routes faltering, governors rebelling, knowledge decaying. The galaxy would fall not with a bang, but with bureaucracy. And when it did, the dark age that followed would last 30,000 years. 30 millennia of silence, ignorance, and fear. Unless someone acted now. Someone who could see beyond the lifespan of kings, beyond the arrogance of emperors, beyond the blindness of tradition. That's where our story begins. But first, a question. If someone told you they could predict the fall of your civilization with mathematical certainty, would you believe them? Or would you call them a heretic? The emperor did not believe, nor did his ministers, his generals, or his priests. They laughed, they threatened, they silenced, because truth is always treason when power feels eternal. But numbers do not lie. And Hari Seldon's equations told a story older than any empire, that order always decays into chaos, that light always breeds shadow, that the future, no matter how carefully controlled, always finds a way to escape its masters. The tragedy of the Galactic Empire is not that it fell, it's that it refused to understand why. Let's step into Trantor now, not as tourists of a glorious city, but as witnesses to its decline. Picture the vast imperial palace, rising like a mountain of glass and titanium. Inside, endless corridors of clerks moving paper across desks, systems running on inertia alone. Beyond them, the great archives, billions of records stretching back to humanity's first expansion into space. The smell of dust on data drives, the echo of forgotten triumphs, and somewhere within, a quiet mathematician surrounded by holographic projections, building the future out of statistics, like a sculptor carving time itself. In another era, he would have been a prophet. In this one, he was a threat because Seldon's discovery wasn't just academic, it was dangerous. If the empire was doomed to fall, then its authority, its very existence, was built on illusion. Every law, every throne, every command was temporary, and no tyrant tolerates being told that their reign is mortal. So the empire tried to destroy the man who had foreseen its death, but you cannot destroy an idea whose time has come. Think of our own world, our own empires, the ones that wear different names but the same mask. Technological empires, economic empires, digital empires. We build systems that seem unbreakable. Algorithms instead of emperors, data instead of decrees. But beneath it all, the same pattern forms: overreach, complacency, decay. Perhaps we are not so different from Trantor after all. Perhaps we too have mistaken scale for stability. And perhaps, like Seldon's empire, we are already living in the calm before collapse. That's the quiet terror of history. It repeats not because we forget, but because we refuse to listen. The great steel planet was the crown of humanity, yet it could no longer feel its pulse. Its rulers spent fortunes maintaining illusions of perfection, while the edges of the galaxy burned in rebellion. Entire sectors lost contact, but the bureaucracy continued to file reports as if nothing had changed. The empire could not die, they said. It was too vast to fail, but entropy doesn't care about size. It cares only that all systems, all structures, all civilizations eventually run out of energy. That is the fate Hari Seldon saw written in the mathematics of history. The fall of Trantor was not an accident, it was a law. And when the laws of nature collide with the arrogance of man, only one side ever wins. The countdown had already begun. Across the galaxy, subtle tremors of decay were spreading. Governors seizing autonomy, scientists losing knowledge, worlds forgetting how to build the machines that once defined them, the light of civilization flickering, slowly, one system at a time. Seldon's vision was not to prevent the fall, but to shorten the darkness that followed, to create an arc of knowledge that could guide humanity through the night. He called it the foundation, and from that single word, foundation, would spring a story spanning 1,000 years of rebirth and revolution. But before light, there must be darkness. Before the foundation, there must be the fall, because the galaxy's greatest city is about to die. And from its ashes, a new future will be born. For 12,000 years, Trantor had been the axis around which the galaxy turned. Its population outnumbered the ancient nations of old Earth combined. Its vaults contained the knowledge of 10 million civilizations. From orbit, its surface glimmered like a sea of molten gold. Every continent fused into one vast city, an empire made solid, a crown of light on the brow of human destiny. But light, as the physicists say, can only shine while the energy holds. In the waning years of the Galactic Empire, that energy began to fade. Imperceptibly at first, like a slow dimming of the stars. Grain shipments from the outer provinces arrived late. The sub-ether relays that once pulsed with the heartbeat of interstellar governance began to stutter. The emperor's decrees reached governors weeks too late to matter, and for the first time in living memory, silence, that alien thing, crept into the great halls of Trantor empires, rarely collapse in explosions. They die in whispers. The bureaucrats of the Imperial Council refused to believe what the data showed. For centuries, Trantor had been the immutable center, its influence measured not in armies but in administration. But when the great web of bureaucracy frays, it does so from within. The records became inconsistent. Budgets vanished into ghost accounts. Ministries forgot their purpose. The capital of 1,000,000 worlds began to forget itself. Trantor's decay was invisible to those who lived in comfort. From the emperor's domed palace to the academies of the mathematicians, life seemed unchanged. The daily shift of functionaries, the pageantry of processions, the endless hum of commerce, all still played their part. But beneath the surface, pressure built. The outer worlds, tired of sending tribute to a distant capital that no longer protected them, rebelled. Ships burned, fleets vanished. In the archives, historians began to notice missing data, entire sectors whose histories were quietly erased. The past itself was beginning to decay. The empire had reached the point all empires reach, the apex where expansion turns into exhaustion. It happened to Rome, to Byzantium, to Britain, civilizations so vast that their own complexity became their enemy. For Trantor, the problem was exponential. Every advance demanded 1,000 systems to sustain it. Every innovation spawned another layer of control. Until one day, the machinery of order outweighed the civilization it was built to preserve. It was inevitable, like a star collapsing under its own gravity. The empire's weight became its doom. And when the collapse came, it was not gradual, it was catastrophic. It began with a whisper of rebellion in the Peshnel sector, then riots in the Siwena cluster, then the loss of contact with the Anacreonian provinces. Within months, chaos spread faster than any fleet could respond. Trantor's fleets, once symbols of invincible might, were stranded by logistics failures. Governors turned warlords. Communication lines severed. The spiral of decline became unstoppable. And at the center of it all, the great city world stood silent, as if listening to its own death because Trantor had never known darkness. Its skies had been hidden under the metal shell of civilization for 20 millennia, but when the power grids failed, for the first time since humanity left Earth, night returned. The citizens of the capital looked up through cracks in the ceiling of steel and saw the stars, cold, ancient, indifferent, staring back. For one moment, the galaxy remembered how small it really was. It's strange how collapse can be beautiful. The spires that once reached heaven now crumbled like sandcastles in a cosmic tide. Fires spread, consuming the archives that held the sum of human memory. The vaults of knowledge, the lifeblood of the empire, burned not by war, but neglect. And as the last fleets fell silent, the historians recorded a single entry. Trantor, jewel of the galaxy, has fallen. The day the galaxy stood still, not because time stopped, but because it finally understood what time had always meant. But this was only the beginning. The fall of Trantor was not an end. It was a reset. The 30,000 years of darkness were beginning. And in the ashes of that fall, one idea would survive, one plan, Hari Seldon's plan. What if destruction itself was part of the design? The smell of Trantor's decay was a strange one. Not the stench of blood and smoke that accompanies ordinary wars, but the acrid tang of overheating circuits, the rot of spoiled food and automated storage, the sterile odor of air scrubbers failing for the first time in centuries. Imagine walking through the lower districts, endless tunnels once alive with the hum of conveyors and voices, now silent except for the occasional echo of dripping condensation. The people had never seen the sun. They had forgotten it even existed. To them, sky was a myth. In the marketplaces, flickering holograms sold luxuries that no longer arrived. Priests of the imperial cult still chanted blessings to an emperor who hadn't left his palace in years. Bureaucrats stamped forms for departments that no longer functioned. And above them, the Senate still debated. Eloquent speeches, polished rhetoric, as if words alone could hold back entropy. That's how civilizations die, not in defeat, but in denial. Philosophers had once argued that human progress was infinite. That reason, once awakened, could never sleep again. Trantor proved them wrong. Reason, too, can decay. Knowledge, too, can rot. Hari Seldon saw it before anyone else. His equations described the collective psychology of 1 trillion humans. The numbers didn't lie. Empires follow predictable arcs: optimism, expansion, consolidation, stagnation, decline. And yet the most chilling part of his model was its universality. No empire had ever escaped. Not Rome, not the British, not even the digital empires of our own era, the great corporate powers of Earth that once thought themselves eternal like Trantor. They too became victims of their own success. They mistook data for wisdom, automation for progress, power for permanence. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes. Trantor's death was just another verse in the same cosmic poem, but inside that ruin, Seldon had found hope. His theory suggested that while individuals are unpredictable, the behavior of masses is not civilization could fall, yes, but its rebirth could be planned. What if chaos could be managed? What if the collapse could be shortened from 30,000 years of barbarism to just 1,000? That was the Seldon plan, the ultimate rebellion against inevitability. Yet as the flames consumed the capital, as the archives burned and knowledge scattered to the void, even Seldon's calm confidence must have trembled, because there's something humbling about watching the physical embodiment of human destiny crumble before your eyes. It's like seeing the future dissolve into dust. And still, there's beauty in that image. Because Trantor's fall was not meaningless. It was transformation. The death of a god, the compost of creation civilizations, like stars, must die for new ones to form. It's easy to romanticize rebirth, but rebirth is never gentle. It begins with fire. Trantor's death was that fire. The spires collapsed not only from war but from neglect. The Empire's fleets didn't explode, they simply stopped being maintained. Great technologies were lost because no one remembered how to use them. Entropy is patient. It doesn't destroy, it unravels. And that is what we see in every age, even our own, when nations become too vast to feel their edges. When systems grow so complex they can no longer adapt. When people stop asking why and only ask how long. That's when the cracks begin. Trantor was a warning, a monument to human arrogance, and a mirror for our own future. Because what is our galaxy now but another empire of data, another Trantor of algorithms and consumption? We live in towers of glass and light. We mistake motion for progress, expansion for meaning, but in the end, entropy always wins. Still, Seldon believed that knowledge could fight back. That while the empire must fall, civilization could endure. Perhaps that's the message buried beneath the ruins, that even in decay there is design the galaxy must burn, so that something wiser may rise. But if the plan depended on knowledge, and knowledge was burning, could even Seldon save it? Deep in the underlevels, where the air tasted of iron and despair, a clerk named Larn was still at his post. He'd worked the same desk for 23 years, processing agricultural quotas from planets that no longer responded. Each morning, he still arrived on time, straightened his chair, and entered the figures by hand. The screens no longer lit, the reports no longer transmitted, but still he wrote, because it was all he knew how to do. Above him, the city shook with distant explosions. Somewhere, a storage vault collapsed. He didn't flinch. He only paused when the lights flickered, and for the first time in his life he saw darkness. He looked up and whispered, "So this is what night looks like." On the surface, soldiers fought meaningless battles over ministries, long-abandoned children scavenged through the ruins of administrative complexes for scraps of food. Priests marched in processions through corridors filled with smoke, chanting prayers to the emperor, whose throne room had already been breached. The emperor himself, last of the Cleonic line, died alone in his palace, surrounded by statues of former glories. No army, no advisors, no witnesses, only silence. And across the city, in a quiet chamber beneath the University of Streeling, Hari Seldon stood watching it all on a flickering screen. He was old now. His hands trembled, but his eyes were clear. This, he said softly, was always part of the equation. His assistant, a young woman named Gal Dornick, turned to him, voice breaking. "You knew it would happen. But this destruction, how can anyone rebuild from this?" Seldon didn't answer immediately. The light from the burning capital reflected in his eyes, not horror, but recognition. "It must fall," he said finally. "Only then can the plan begin." Outside, the spires collapsed in slow motion. Great pillars of civilization turned to dust. And yet somewhere far beyond, on a distant, unremarkable planet called Terminus, ships were landing, crates of books, data, machinery, and mines were being unloaded. A seed, carried in secret, was being planted. The foundation had begun. The galaxy did not know it yet. It only knew the sound of its own heart breaking. But from that silence came the whisper of rebirth. The fall of Trantor was not the end. It was Act 1, and beyond the ashes of the Empire, the mathematics of destiny were already unfolding. Because even as the city burned, Seldon's voice, calm, eternal, echoed through history. The fall is necessary, the rebirth inevitable. There are moments in history when a single mind changes the trajectory of civilization. Archimedes sketching war machines in the sand. Newton glimpsing gravity in the fall of an apple. Einstein bending the very fabric of space and time. But Hari Seldon's revelation dwarfed them all. He was born not in a palace, but in a forgotten province of Helicon, a small, humid world far from Trantor's shining spires. To the imperial scholars, Helicon was irrelevant, but from its dusty academies came the man who would quantify the rise and fall of empires themselves. His creation was called psychohistory, a word so strange, so audacious, that even now it feels like heresy. It was neither prophecy nor fortune-telling. It was mathematics, pure and cold. A fusion of sociology, psychology, and statistical mechanics, a calculus of civilization. In the grand tradition of science, it began not as ambition, but as curiosity. Seldon wanted to know, could the behavior of millions, even billions, be predicted with the same precision as atoms in motion? If the laws of thermodynamics governed stars and the laws of probability governed matter, could the same be true of human history? At first his colleagues laughed. The human mind, they said, was too chaotic, too emotional, too free. But Seldon wasn't interested in individuals. He was interested in masses. One man might be unpredictable, but a trillion men followed patterns. That was his breakthrough, that free will vanishes at scale. From that realization, the equations grew. What began as simple models expanded into entire mathematical civilizations, simulated histories spanning millennia, and what they showed terrified him. Every model led to the same conclusion. The empire's collapse was inevitable. The numbers didn't waver, didn't care, didn't lie. He tested every variable: economics, military strength, population density, even cultural decay. And still the equations sang the same song, a crescendo of decline, a dissonance of entropy. The fall of Trantor was written into the mathematics of human behavior itself. And Seldon, unlike the bureaucrats of the empire, had the courage to face it. He began to publish fragments, dense theoretical papers that only a handful of scholars could even read. At first, they were dismissed as abstract speculation. Then, as unrest spread through the outer sectors and the data aligned with his predictions, The laughter stopped, and the fear began. The emperor summoned him. The mathematician was brought before the highest tribunal in the galaxy, accused of treason. Because in a civilization that worships permanence, the man who proves its mortality is always the enemy. The trial was a spectacle. In the court of the Galactic Council, under the dome of living crystal, Seldon stood alone before the assembled ministers and generals of the Empire. He did not plead. He did not apologize. He presented his equations. When the judges demanded proof, he showed them projections, curves of collapse, models of anarchy, and the timeline, 30,000 years of chaos to follow the fall. The hall fell silent. Then he said something that would echo through the ages. "I do not come to destroy the Empire. I come to save its future." That was how the Seldon Plan was born, a project to preserve the essence of civilization through the storm of barbarism to come. To compress 30 millennia of darkness into just 1,000 years, the plan would create a sanctuary of knowledge at the edge of the galaxy, a seed from which the next empire could grow, the foundation, and thus the mathematics of destiny became the blueprint of survival. But destiny, even when written in numbers, is never absolute because equations cannot account for faith, or fear, or love. And though Seldon's formulae could model civilizations, they could never predict individuals that would prove to be both his greatest strength and his greatest blind spot. What happens when a plan built on mathematics collides with the chaos of the human soul? Imagine the chamber where psychohistory was born, a small office in the University of Streeling, half buried beneath the endless layers of Trantor's metallic crust. The air hums with machinery, walls lined with glowing hollow maps, each one a model of human civilization rendered in shimmering lines of light. Equations dance like constellations across the room, shifting with each input. Seldon sits at the center, thin, gray-haired, eyes sharp with sleepless purpose. His hands move across the console like a pianist's, coaxing symphonies of probability from the chaos of human behavior. Outside, the city rumbles. The Empire trembles, yet within these walls, the universe feels calm. Numbers are honest, after all. His assistant, Gall Dornick, watches the curves form, sweeping arcs representing entire civilizations, their lifespans rising and falling in perfect harmony. She whispers, "It's like watching history breathe." Seldon nods, but there's no triumph in his gaze, only melancholy. "Yes," he says, "and every breath brings it closer to its end." The deeper you dive into psychohistory, the more it feels less like science and more like theology. Not a faith in gods, but in patterns, in inevitability. The equations suggest that freedom itself is an illusion at scale, that while one person might rebel, a billion will always behave predictably. It's a cruel symmetry, because the very same mathematics that can save humanity also deny its individuality. Seldon was both savior and executioner. The plan promised rebirth, but only through manipulation. The foundations would not know the full truth. They would be guided by carefully staged crises, each one designed to keep history on track. Was that genius or tyranny? Is it moral to enslave the future to save it? These were the questions that haunted him in the silent hours between calculations. In his journals, those secret writings that would one day become scripture, he mused on fate. "Free will," he wrote, "is the illusion that makes obedience bearable." Philosophers on 1,000 worlds would debate that line for centuries. And yet, even now, we can see echoes of it in our own age. The algorithms that shape our desires, the predictive models that anticipate our behavior, the social systems that know what we will do before we do it. Are they not, in their own way, psychohistory's children? We too live in Seldon's shadow. Every click, every choice, every act of rebellion, all absorbed into the data. The illusion of freedom within a system that has already predicted our next move. The dream of psychohistory was never just fiction. It was prophecy disguised as science fiction. because today we too build models to predict economies, revolutions, elections, even emotions. We call it data analytics. We call it artificial intelligence, but Hari Seldon would have called it destiny. Still, even destiny must be guided, and Seldon's plan required more than numbers. It required faith. He built the foundations not merely as archives of knowledge, but as societies designed to survive the coming darkness. The first foundation, at Terminus, on the edge of the galaxy, would preserve the physical sciences. The second foundation, hidden, secret, at Star's End, would preserve the science of the mind. Two halves of the same whole. One visible, one invisible, one to rule through knowledge, the other through subtlety. Together, they would guide humanity through the 1,000-year night. But as Seldon finalized his equations, one question lingered, not in his mathematics, but in his heart. Could humanity truly be predicted? Could the human soul, irrational, passionate, defiant, ever be reduced to a variable? He wanted to believe yes, but somewhere deep down, a whisper of doubt remained, and history would prove that doubt right. Because no equation can account for the anomaly, the day of his sentencing was the day his legend began. In the grand chamber of judgment, under the glittering dome of Trantor, the court gathered, senators, generals, priests, the entire machinery of the empire assembled to witness the trial of the man who dared to predict their doom. Seldon stood calmly, his robe simple, his voice measured. The chief commissioner sneered from the bench. "You claim the empire will fall. You spread fear. You incite treason. For what? To be remembered as a prophet?" Seldon's reply was almost gentle. "No, to be remembered as a mathematician." A ripple of laughter. Then silence. He raised his hand and the air filled with holographic projections, graphs of decline, population models, social decay curves, all converging toward the same point, collapse. "These," he said, "are not predictions. They are inevitabilities. The numbers require no belief, only understanding." The judges glanced uneasily at the curves. One asked, "And what of hope, Professor Seldon? Is that in your equations too?" He smiled faintly. "Hope," he said, "is the constant." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the verdict came: exile, not execution. The empire would not make him a martyr. Instead, they would send him and his followers to the edge of the galaxy, to a barren world called Terminus, to compile an encyclopedia of human knowledge. A harmless project, they thought. But Seldon knew better. He had hidden his true purpose beneath layers of deception. The Encyclopedia Foundation was only the shell. The real mission, the plan, was already in motion. And so the man who foresaw the fall of the empire was sent away to build its successor. As the transport ship departed Trantor, Seldon stood by the viewport, watching the steel planet recede into the distance, its light already dimming. Beside him, Gall Dornick whispered, "They think they've silenced you." He shook his head. "No, they've given us time." Behind him, crates of data, machinery, and mines filled the hold, the seeds of a future civilization. And within his private journal, encoded in layers of mathematics, he left messages to be revealed centuries after his death, Seldon crises, pre-calculated moments of decision where history would pivot. At each crisis, a holographic Seldon would appear to guide his descendants, like a ghost made of numbers. But not even he could foresee everything. Because somewhere in the future, an anomaly was waiting, a variable outside the equation, a single mind powerful enough to alter the destiny of billions and tear the plan apart. His name was the Mule, but that is another story. For now, the ship bearing the hope of humanity slipped into hyperspace, leaving behind the glittering corpse of Trantor, and as the stars stretched into lines, Seldon whispered a final thought, one only the galaxy could hear. The future is not to be feared, only calculated. On the very edge of the galaxy, beneath a pale and dying sun, humanity began again. The planet was called Terminus, a name chosen half in jest, half in prophecy. It was the last inhabited world before the great dark between galaxies, the edge of everything known. There were no metals here, no armies, no fortresses, only scientists, engineers, historians, and mathematicians, refugees from the splendor of Trantor, carrying within them the one thing that could not be destroyed: knowledge. They had come at the command of Hari Seldon, exiled yet exalted. The Emperor believed they had been banished to compile an Encyclopedia Galactica, a grand archive to preserve all human understanding before the coming darkness. But the encyclopedia was only a mask. Beneath it lay the Seldon Plan, the great design to compress 30,000 years of chaos into a single millennium terminus would not just record civilization, it would rebuild it. The early years were harsh. No imperial ships came to trade. The soil was thin, the winters long, but the minds of Terminus were sharper than any blade. They built, they experimented, they endured. Without armies, they learned to defend themselves with ideas. Without gold, they traded in knowledge. And thus began the rise of the Foundation. At first, they clung to Seldon's vision like scripture. His name became myth, his equations, a new kind of faith. The first generation of colonists gathered each year in the great dome at the center of Terminus City to listen to the recorded words of the prophet of probability, his holographic image flickering, serene, ageless. Each time, Seldon appeared to foretell another stage of history, another Seldon crisis. The first came when the Foundation realized the truth. The Empire was dying faster than anyone had imagined. The neighboring worlds, once ruled by governors and viceroys of Trantor, now fell into barbarism, ruled by petty kings who wore the trappings of empire but none of its wisdom. The outer rim was fragmenting. And in that chaos, the Foundation saw opportunity. Salvor Hardin, the first mayor of Terminus, understood what Seldon had foreseen but never said aloud. When armies fail, belief becomes the new empire. Hardin was not a scientist, but he knew power. He saw that the Foundation's knowledge, its mastery of atomic energy, its understanding of medicine, navigation, and chemistry, could be transformed into something more potent than weapons. It could become religion. He forged a new faith, the Church of Galactic Spirit. To the barbarian worlds around them, the Foundation's technologies appeared as miracles. Self-powering engines, radiant lamps that never dimmed, medicines that cured in moments. Priests, trained on Terminus, spread across the neighboring kingdoms, teaching the rituals of maintenance, the liturgies of science. But the truth was hidden. The rituals were controls, the miracles mechanisms of obedience. The outer worlds worshipped the atomic power, and through that worship, they served the Foundation. No armies, no conquests, only faith. And thus, religion became the first weapon of the new empire. But faith, once spread, is a dangerous tool because belief cannot be contained forever. And when the priests became powerful, when the kings began to question, when superstition turned to rebellion, a second crisis arose. Then came the next evolution, trade. As the centuries passed, the Foundation transformed. The first generation of priest engineers gave way to a new class, merchants, traders who sailed through the void not with weapons, but with cargo, technologies that no one else could produce, offered in exchange for raw materials, loyalty, and silence. The merchant princes of the Foundation became the lifeblood of a new economy that spanned the ruins of the old empire. Where once emperors commanded fleets, now traders commanded influence worlds. That had once scoffed at the scholars of Terminus now bowed to their science. And every transaction, every trade agreement, every whispered deal in a distant marketplace drew another planet into the orbit of the Foundation's power. No wars were fought, none were needed. Information was currency, innovation was dominance. Knowledge, as Seldon had predicted, became the supreme weapon. But the beauty of the plan lay not in its conquests, but in its inevitability. Each Seldon crisis was not a disaster, but a test, a moment designed to ensure the Foundation's evolution from fragile colony to empire of reason. Each time a crisis came, political, religious, economic, the people gathered in the time vault to hear Seldon's recorded words. And each time his prediction came true, he appeared, calm and timeless, as if he had seen every step. "The future cannot be stopped," he said. "It can only be guided." To the citizens of the Foundation, he was no longer merely a scientist, he was destiny itself. But beneath the calm surface, tensions brewed. Some whispered that they were slaves to a plan written centuries before. Others feared that dependence on Seldon's prophecy made them blind to the present. The faith that once united them began to crack, and into that doubt stepped new powers: the Traders' Guild, the Council of Mayors, the Board of Religion. Each sought to steer the Foundation in its own image. Hardin's maxim was still carved above the hall of government: violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. But as the Foundation grew rich and proud, some began to forget the wisdom behind it. When trade became politics and commerce became control, the Foundation became what it was built to replace: a new empire, wrapped in the robes of science. The circle was beginning again. 100 years after Seldon's exile, a merchant named Hober Mallow stood on the deck of his starship, the Spirit of Terminus, watching a dying sun flicker through the viewing dome. He had come to the world of Coral, a planet of rust and shadows where the people still prayed to the galactic spirit. Though few priests remained, Mallow was no missionary. He came to trade, but behind his commerce was strategy. He suspected something heretical: that the dying empire was not truly dead, that somewhere beyond the rim its fleets still stirred. And if that were true, then the Foundation's dominance was in peril. On Coral, he found factories still powered by atomic engines, imperial design, centuries old but still functional. He realized then that the Foundation's monopoly on knowledge was not complete. The ghosts of Trantor still haunted the galaxy. Returning to Terminus, he challenged the old order. "The age of priests is over," he declared to the council. "Faith cannot rule forever. Trade is the future. Free trade, strong ships, open hands." He was accused of blasphemy. But when the Corellian War broke out, when the old empire's weapons returned to the field, it was Mallow's ships, not the priests, that saved the Foundation. Not by fighting, but by starving the enemy, cutting off trade, supply, and knowledge until surrender was inevitable. The victory was bloodless, and when the dust settled, Mallow became the first merchant prince to rule Terminus. Thus ended the Age of Faith. The Foundation entered its second phase, the Age of Commerce. The priests became obsolete, the traders became kings. But beneath the surface, the shadow of Seldon remained, each century a new crisis. Each solution foreseen, each triumph predicted, until one day the hologram flickered and failed. Seldon appeared, as always, serene, but this time his words were different. "My friends," he said, "I have guided you thus far, but the equations end here. Beyond this point lies uncertainty." And with that, the image dissolved. Silence filled the vault. For the first time in centuries, the Foundation stood without prophecy, without guidance, without certainty. And in that silence, something ancient stirred: ambition, fear, chaos. From the depths of the dying empire, a new power would rise, not predicted by the plan, not bound by mathematics. A man who could twist hearts, bend minds, and reshape destiny itself. The plan had no variable for him, but that belongs to the next arc, because even in a galaxy built on reason, one truth remains eternal. Knowledge may conquer, but it can never control every plan, no matter how perfect, hides its flaw. Every equation has its ghost, a variable unaccounted for, a tremor beneath the logic of the universe. For Hari Seldon, that ghost had a name. They would come to call him the Mule. By the time of his rise, the Foundation ruled half the galaxy, not in name, that was too primitive a measure, but in influence. Its trade routes connected 1,000 systems, its science dominated every frontier. On Terminus, the Council of Traders had grown into an empire of economists and admirals, ruling from offices that glowed with cold, sterile light. They believed the plan had become unstoppable. Seldon's holograms still appeared, punctually, every century, predicting crises, confirming victories, speaking words that always seemed to fit the moment. But what happens when prophecy becomes routine? When the miracle becomes bureaucracy? The citizens of the Foundation stopped listening, they stopped believing. And in that silence, the anomaly crept in. It began at the edges, obscure worlds in the kingdoms of the periphery, planets whose names meant nothing to Terminus, but whose rebellions disrupted trade, communication, and power. At first it was rumor, fleets surrendering without battle, entire planets switching allegiance overnight, admirals vanishing. Then the stories turned stranger armies that marched in perfect unity, citizens who worshipped their conqueror with the devotion of zealots. No one could explain it, except to whisper that their leader was not human. As others were, he called himself the Mule. He was tall, frail, stooped, a figure who should have inspired pity, not terror. Yet those who met his gaze felt their fear melt into loyalty. His voice carried the weight of belief itself. He conquered without blood. He ruled without resistance. No historian could explain how his empire spread so fast. No psychohistorian could predict him, and that was the first fracture in the plan. On Terminus, panic rippled through the great halls of government. Psychohistorians scrambled through Seldon's equations, searching for any mention of such a figure. There was none. Psychohistory was built on mass behavior, the mathematics of billions. It could predict the movements of empires, the rise of ideologies, the slow drift of civilizations, but it could not account for one man. The Mule was the flaw in the calculus of destiny, and when his fleets reached the borders of the Foundation, every assumption of 1,000 years shattered. The first worlds to fall did so in silence. Foundation garrisons reported no battles, no uprisings, only submission. When reinforcements arrived, they found smiling citizens welcoming the invaders as liberators. On Calgon, the seat of pleasure and luxury, the Mule's banners rose overnight. His generals claimed the planet without firing a shot. The city's opulent towers shimmered under new insignia. A stylized mutation of the imperial eagle twisted into an unfamiliar spiral. Something unnatural was spreading. Reports came of entire populations abandoning their oaths, surrendering weapons, dismantling their own defenses. Admirals, once proud and cunning, now served the Mule with religious devotion. When questioned, their voices were calm. He brings peace, they said. He brings joy. But behind their smiles was emptiness. It took time for the truth to surface. The Mule was not merely charismatic. He was a mutant, the first known in centuries. His power was not telepathy in the crude sense. He could not read thoughts. He could reshape emotion, bend fear into loyalty, hate into worship. Empires had fallen to armies. The Foundation would fall to a feeling. No one could resist him. No one could fight an enemy they loved. And as his influence spread, the equations of psychohistory began to crumble. Predictions no longer matched outcomes. The plan, once flawless, was collapsing under the weight of anomaly. The holographic vault opened one final time. Seldon appeared, calm as ever, speaking of a trade crisis long since past. His words now irrelevant, his vision overtaken by chaos. The scientists of Terminus watched in silence, the plan, their faith, their destiny, obsolete. For the first time, the galaxy was truly unpredictable. Without the guidance of psychohistory, the Foundation was forced to confront reality, not the certainty of mathematics, but the terror of free will. Generals turned traitor, cities fell overnight. And as the Mule's fleet closed in, the mighty Foundation, the empire built from reason, faced annihilation. It was the end of inevitability. Modern parallels shimmer beneath this tale like reflections in a black mirror. What is the Mule, if not the modern demagogue? a figure who bypasses reason and speaks directly to the emotions of the masses? What is psychohistory, if not our faith in algorithms, in data, in systems that promise to predict human behavior until a single unpredictable anomaly breaks them? We see it now, in politics that defy polling, in markets that collapse against all logic, in revolutions sparked not by armies, but by influence. The mule was the first viral contagion of the soul. And like all contagions, he spread because people wanted to believe. The Foundation's resistance crumbled. Star by star, world by world, his empire expanded until Terminus itself stood alone. No weapon could stop him. No plan could contain him. The galaxy had fallen under one man's mind, and the future, for the first time in 12,000 years, was unwritten. In the aftermath of chaos, amid the ruins of certainty, a handful of fugitives fled into the darkness between stars. Among them was Beta Darrell, a woman of quiet strength, born on the planet Haven beside her, traveled her husband Toran, and a weary old scientist named Ebling Miss. They carried no weapons, no armies, only a single desperate hope, to rediscover the Second Foundation, the secret order Hari Seldon had hidden at the opposite end of the galaxy. If the first Foundation had fallen, perhaps the second could restore the plan. Their ship slipped through the starless void like a ghost. Behind them, the mule's fleet spread like fire across the night. Ebling Mies was a man possessed. In the shadowed cabin, he muttered equations, searching for a clue, the coordinates of the Second Foundation, the last hope of psychohistory. Beta watched him with growing dread. His obsession deepened, sleep vanished, reason frayed. The mule was still out there, hunting them not for death, but conversion. He wanted them alive, because the mule, for all his power, was lonely. He could control minds, but not hearts. He could command loyalty, but never love. And in Beta, he saw something he could not understand: compassion untouched by fear. In a ruined library on the world of Trantor, now a carcass of its former glory, they found fragments of Seldon's final work. Among the endless tunnels of dust and silence, Ebling Mies uncovered the truth. The Second Foundation was real. It existed, and he had found its location. But before he could speak, Beta raised her weapon. The old man looked at her in shock. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "This knowledge could save us all." She shook her head. "It would destroy us," she said. And she fired. Ebling Mies fell, the last man to know the coordinates of the Second Foundation. Moments later, the shadows parted. The mule stood there, tall, thin, weary, his eyes vast and sorrowful. He looked at Beta not with rage, but with infinite sadness. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said softly. "I only wanted to be understood." And in that instant, Beta realized the truth. She had met him before, not as conqueror, but as clown. The traveling jester who had entertained them months earlier, the frail, awkward performer whose laughter seemed tinged with pain, had been the mule in disguise. He had hidden among them, seeking friendship he could not command, and when he failed to win it, he turned to conquest. The anomaly was not a monster. He was a man who could not bear loneliness. The mule left them alive. He had won the galaxy, but lost the only thing he truly wanted: connection. For years, his empire endured, vast, stable, unquestioned. But it was built on his mind alone, and when he died, it crumbled overnight. Psychohistory resumed its slow rhythm. The equations healed. The plan corrected itself, but something fundamental had changed. The universe had learned that destiny could be broken, that the future was not absolute. That one heart, defiant and unpredictable, could rewrite the story of billions. And so, in the grand calculus of civilization, a new variable was born, one that even Hari Seldon could never quantify. The human soul. Every empire has its shadow, every plan its silent correction. While the galaxy looked to Terminus, the proud steel beacon of the First Foundation, another power watched from afar. It did not build ships, it did not trade, it did not fight, it remembered. Hari Seldon had always known that the First Foundation alone would not be enough. Science could preserve knowledge, yes, but who would preserve the plan itself? Who would guide humanity when mathematics failed, when chaos swallowed reason? And so, in the last years of his life, Seldon founded another refuge, a second seed, hidden at Star's End. Its name was whispered only in myth, the Second Foundation. To the scholars of Terminus, it was legend, a metaphor for hope, but in truth, it was very real, and it was watching. While the first foundation rose through technology and trade, the second grew in silence, shaping minds rather than machines. It gathered those rarest of mutations, the mentalics, men and women who could feel emotion as color, thought as shape, telepaths, empathic manipulators, philosophers of the unseen. Where the first foundation measured atoms, the second measured consciousness. Hidden among the star clusters at the far end of the galaxy, they studied not matter, but motive, not power, but the will to power. For centuries, they remained in the shadows, correcting errors in the plan by the lightest touch, a whisper in a ruler's mind, a suggestion to a scientist, a quiet nudge to a diplomat. Civilizations shifted by degrees, and no one knew why. The Seldon plan remained on course. History obeyed. But even the perfect hand cannot move forever without being seen. Rumors spread among the worlds of a secret empire, a cabal that guided fate. Traders spoke of invisible masters who steered the galaxy's course. And on Terminus, where faith in psychohistory had been shaken by the mule, such whispers became obsession. If the second foundation was real, perhaps it held the key to understanding everything that had gone wrong. Perhaps it could be controlled. The first foundation began to hunt for the second. The hunter did not realize it was already prey. For the second foundation, the mule's reign had been the ultimate emergency. He had torn holes in psychohistory's fabric, holes that could only be repaired by manipulation so delicate it bordered on divine. Their agents infiltrated his court, altered memories, pacified his generals. They could not kill him, not directly, but they could wait for nature to claim what no mind could cure, his mortality. And when he died, they erased him from the collective memory of billions. To most of the galaxy, the mule became a footnote, a forgotten tyrant, swallowed by the tide of history. The plan resumed, balance restored, or so it seemed. Generations later, on the world of Tazenda, a young psychologist named Arkady Durrell, descendant of the same Beta Durrell who had defied the mule, began her own quiet investigation. The galaxy had grown prosperous again. The Foundation ruled in all but name. Yet Arkady felt the same unease her ancestors once had, that unseen minds were shaping her every thought. Her studies led her to forbidden archives, fragments of data long erased, records of voices that should not exist. Each clue pointed to the same impossible conclusion. The second foundation had survived. And worse, it had never left. It was here. Arkady's search became a descent into paranoia. Were her mentors guiding her or manipulating her? Were her discoveries truly her own, or planted to lead her to a predetermined realization? The closer she came to truth, the more the world around her seemed to bend. Faces blurred. Memories contradicted themselves. Time itself felt uncertain. This was the Second Foundation's defense mechanism, psychological camouflage. For to find them was to be found by them. The mentalics of Star's End called themselves the speakers of the plan. They believed themselves the custodians of civilization's soul. Through them, psychohistory was not numbers on a screen. It was a living consciousness, self-correcting, evolving. But over the centuries, their mission twisted. The more they intervened, the more they began to see themselves not as servants of destiny, but as its authors. And authors crave perfection. They began to edit humanity's story too thoroughly. They erased wars before they began, silenced dissent before it sparked, pruned ideologies that strayed from the statistical norm. Peace endured, but it was the peace of sedation. The galaxy was becoming docile, predictable, tranquil, and soulless. In a quiet chamber beneath the silver spires of Star's End, the first speaker of the second foundation looked into the void of probability. "We have guided humanity for 1,000 years," he whispered. "Yet what if, in protecting it, we have caged it?" A pause. Then the reply from one of his adepts, "Would you rather chaos?" He did not answer because he knew the truth. Order, left unchecked, becomes its own kind of barbarism. The final crisis began with a whisper. The first foundation had found them, or believed it had. A fleet, commanded by scientists turned zealots, set out toward the mythical Star's End, armed not with weapons but with equations designed to expose deception. They sought to measure thought. They never returned. When their ships emerged months later, their crews reported nothing unusual. Their memories were clear, their instruments intact. And yet, in their eyes, a strange serenity glowed, unnatural calm, like minds too perfectly balanced. They had been touched by the second foundation. The hunters had been rewritten. Arkady Durrell escaped that fate, barely. She fled across the spiral arms, carrying fragments of memory the Mentalics could not erase, fragments that told a darker secret. The second foundation was not at Star's End at all. It was at Star's beginnings, not the edge of the galaxy, but the center Trantor. The corpse of the old empire had become the hidden heart of the new. In the labyrinth beneath its ruined metal crust, the guardians of the plan waited, unseen, shaping the thoughts of humanity's rulers. The second foundation was not gone. It had become the empire it once sought to guide. Arkady's revelation spread quietly. Like rumor through a dream, no one believed her. Then everyone did, because once you glimpse the machinery behind reality, you can never unsee it. On 100 worlds, philosophers, historians, and common citizens began to question the nature of their peace. Was the tranquility of the galaxy a miracle or manipulation? Were their thoughts truly their own? The second foundation faced a paradox more dangerous than any war. To protect humanity, it had to remain hidden. But to remain hidden, it had to suppress humanity's freedom to know. Knowledge, once the savior of civilization, had become its cage. The first speaker stood again before his council, their minds linked in perfect harmony. A chorus of intellect, he saw their serenity and felt only dread. The Seldon plan was meant to save humanity from darkness, he said. But what if we have only replaced one darkness with another? He reached into the plan's equations, into the luminous web of probability, and saw a future none of his predecessors had dared to look at directly. It was not the rebirth of the empire that awaited. It was a loop. Empires rise, empires fall. Even the plan is just another empire. Of the mind, the galaxy would never be free while any hand claimed to guide it, and so he made the unthinkable choice. He erased the memory of the second foundation, from archives, from history, even from the minds of his own people. He scattered the survivors across the stars, dissolving their unity, freeing humanity from their unseen grip. As his consciousness faded into the collective void, his final thought echoed through the psychic ether. The plan must end, so that freedom may begin. In the silence that followed, the galaxy stirred. For the first time in 1,000 years, humanity's future was uncertain again. There were no prophecies, no guardians, no cages, only the open stars, vast and uncharted. And somewhere, in the ruins of Trantor, a new idea was forming, one that would reshape everything again. But that belongs to the next act, when the fires of collapse become the light of renewal. Because in the end, the only constant in the universe is not order, not chaos. It is change. Trantor burns. The planet that once ruled 1,000,000 worlds now glows in silence, a molten scar beneath a blackened sky. Steel towers, once the arteries of civilization, stand like the ribs of some ancient creature, bleached by the fires of its own hubris. The age of empire is over. But from its ashes, the whisper of rebirth stirs again. On Terminus, a young historian records the final transmission of the last Seldon crisis. The hologram of Hari Seldon flickers to life, older, more tired than before, yet still smiling. "You have done well," he says. "The plan was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to give you time." He looks directly into the camera, his eyes bright with the kind of hope only the dead can afford. Empires die, but knowledge endures. The recording ends. The room falls silent. Outside, the twin suns of Terminus rise over a city rebuilt not by kings or conquerors, but by thinkers, explorers, and dreamers. And somewhere in that sunrise, the voice of the past fades, and the future begins to hum. Centuries pass. The scars of the old empire vanish beneath new architecture, new philosophies, new forms of governance. The galaxy enters its second golden age. But if history has taught anything, it's that golden ages are only the lull between storms. Trade becomes profit, profit becomes corruption. Corruption breeds power, and power, inevitably, builds its own empire. The foundation, once founded to preserve freedom through knowledge, begins to act like the tyrants it replaced. Archives turn into instruments of control. Science becomes privilege, and those who question the plan are branded heretics. The irony is almost cosmic. The very system designed to save humanity from empire becomes one itself. Meanwhile, in the forgotten ruins of Trantor, explorers stumble upon fragments of the past, cracked data crystals, faded inscriptions, echoes of a civilization that once believed it could engineer eternity. Among the rubble, one finds a simple phrase etched into a wall, centuries old, scrawled in a forgotten dialect. The future is not a formula. No one knows who wrote it. Some say it was Hari Seldon himself. Others claim it was one of the last speakers of the Second Foundation, leaving behind a warning. But the meaning is clear enough. History is not a machine. It is a mirror, reflecting the flaws of those who gaze into it. As the galaxy moves through its next age, something changes, not in the stars, but in the hearts of the people who inhabit them. They begin to question the very concept of destiny. They ask, if every civilization is doomed to collapse, what makes us keep building them again? Maybe it's not ignorance, maybe it's defiance. To build, knowing it will one day fall, is an act of faith, not in permanence, but in purpose. Because while no empire lasts forever, the impulse that creates them, the will to organize, to connect, to dream beyond oneself, that is eternal. Hari Seldon tried to predict the rise and fall of civilization, but even he, the greatest mathematician who ever lived, could not quantify that spark. It is not rational, it cannot be modeled. And that's why it survives. The camera pans across the galaxy, planets glimmering like neurons in an infinite brain, each one telling the same story in its own tongue, of rise and ruin, discovery and loss, collapse and renewal. From the ashes of one world, another finds light. From the ruins of another, a third builds new myths. The cycle continues, not as tragedy, but as rhythm. A heartbeat that transcends any one age, any one species. Civilization doesn't die. It evolves. We return once more to Trantor. Centuries have passed. The world is green again. Forests reclaim the steel skeletons. Rivers flow through the canyons of old highways. Wildlife roams through the hollow shells of once titanic domes. At the center of this reborn world stands the one structure left untouched, the vault. The resting place of Hari Seldon's recordings. For ages, no one has dared to open it. Until now, a young child, no older than 10, stands before it. Descendant of no dynasty, follower of no creed. Just curious. She touches the surface. The door slides open. Inside, the walls shimmer with millions of holograms, maps, equations, fragments of history. But they no longer project certainty. They pulse like living light, open, unfinished, incomplete. The final message plays. Not from Seldon, but from an unknown voice, perhaps a later speaker, perhaps the plan itself, evolved into sentience. The galaxy no longer needs a plan, it needs memory, so that when the next darkness comes, you will remember what light once looked like. The holograms fade, only one remains, the image of a spiral galaxy turning slowly in the void. The child watches, silent, then whispers, "We'll try again." Cut to black. Then a single line appears, white against the void. If every empire must fall, can even our own world escape the same fate? The narration returns, softer now, almost human. Empires rise not because of greed or conquest, but because we dream of order. They fall because that order forgets its purpose. The story of Asimov's galaxy is not about the death of civilization. It's about its persistence, its refusal to give up, even when the equations say it must. Every city we build, every archive we protect, every question we dare to ask, that's how we fight entropy. The universe may trend toward collapse, but humanity trends toward meaning. And that, perhaps, is our true foundation. The stars return, thousands of them flickering like old film. The music swells, a slow, mournful crescendo rising into something luminous. The narrator speaks one final time. Hari Seldon was right. Empires die, but knowledge endures. And as long as someone, somewhere, remembers why the stars once mattered, the story will never end. Fade to black silence. Then, one heartbeat, one note of light. The spiral begins again,